My name is Nathan Cole, and today I share Karen's stories who turned away from warnings that could have kept them alive. From a Karen who forced her way into a restricted corridor, to a Karen who kept spray painting a stranger's car and got her karma in the craziest way possible. It was the morning of March 14th, 2016, in Dayton, Ohio. Overcast, cold, the kind of Tuesday where nothing about it stands out. People were heading to work, going through their routines. Nothing about that stretch of road suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Brenda Tullock was 44 years old. She worked as an office administrator at a property management firm about 3 blocks east of a large warehouse facility on the same road. People who worked with her would tell you she was capable at her job. Organized, sharp, got things done. But she was also the kind of person who had a hard time accepting that rules applied to her the same way they applied to everyone else. If there was a sign, she questioned whether it was necessary. If someone corrected her, she pushed back. Co-workers had learned over time that pointing anything out to Brenda usually made things worse, so most of them just stopped trying. That kind of attitude is exhausting to be around, honestly, and it followed her everywhere she went. There had been an incident the previous year where she had gotten into a prolonged argument with a building security officer over a parking validation policy she disagreed with, and had refused to leave the lobby until a manager came down to deal with her personally. That was the kind of thing Brenda did. For about 2 years leading up to that morning, Brenda had been cutting through the warehouse property on her walk from the parking structure to her office. It saved her maybe 4 minutes. The corridor she used had signage discouraging unauthorized foot traffic, but nobody had ever formally stopped her, and that was all Brenda needed to keep doing it. In her mind, she had been doing it long enough that it had become her route, something she was entitled to. March 14th started like any other morning as she parked, grabbed her bag, and headed toward the warehouse corridor around 8:20 a.m. Except that morning, there was a worker standing at the entrance. He was in his late 20s, and he was there specifically to keep people out. The corridor had been treated with a solvent-based industrial floor sealant the previous evening as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle. That type of product releases heavy vapors during and after application, and the manufacturer's guidelines required a minimum of 24 hours of active ventilation before the space could be safely re-entered. The ventilation system for that section of the warehouse happened to be offline for unrelated repairs, meaning the fumes had been accumulating overnight in a confined corridor with little to no airflow. The worker explained this to Brenda. He told her the corridor was closed, told her the air inside was not safe, and told her she needed to use the outer walkway instead. A second warehouse employee was standing nearby and heard the entire exchange. By their account, Brenda did not hesitate. She told the worker she had been walking through every morning for years and that no one had ever stopped her before. When he held his position and repeated the warning, she told him he had no authority over her, stepped around him, and walked into the corridor. He called after her, twice. She kept walking. She made it approximately 38 feet inside before her pace began to slow. Witnesses later described her appearing unsteady, reaching briefly toward the wall before she collapsed. The worker at the entrance did not see her go down immediately. It was the second employee who had followed at a distance out of concern who spotted her on the ground and raised the alarm. By the time anyone reached her, Brenda had been unconscious for several minutes inside a poorly ventilated enclosed corridor where solvent vapors had accumulated to high concentrations overnight. There was not a lot that could be done at that point. She was unresponsive when workers reached her, having already been exposed to a sustained concentration of toxic fumes. Brenda Tullock was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was acute toxic inhalation. Both workers provided statements to authorities, and their accounts were consistent with one another. The corridor was sealed off, the facility was reviewed, and the case was closed. That worker did everything right, and I think that is what makes it stick. Next up is a woman at a dinner table, and what she did when a stranger tried to help her is something I still find hard to wrap my head around. It was the evening of July 9th, 2017, in Charlotte, North Carolina. A warm Saturday, the kind where restaurants fill up early and stay busy well into the night. The commercial districts around the city were doing what they always did on a weekend: parking lots, filling up, people moving in and out of restaurants, the usual rhythm of a summer evening. Patrice Hendro was 38 years old. She worked in client relations at a mid-sized logistics company, a job that required her to be personable and composed when it counted. By most accounts, she could manage that at work. Outside of it, though, Patrice had a reputation among people who knew her for being loud, combative, aggressive and nearly impossible to reason with once she had made up her mind. She took a particular kind of offense at unsolicited opinions, especially in public. Friends described her as someone who treated outside input as a personal challenge rather than something worth considering. That kind of personality is one I come across a lot in these stories, and it never gets easier to understand. Dining out seemed to bring that side of her out more than most situations. She had strong opinions about food, considered herself knowledgeable, and did not appreciate anyone suggesting otherwise. By the summer of 2017, her reputation at several restaurants in her area was well established among staff. She had complained loudly on multiple occasions, sent dishes back repeatedly, and on at least one occasion had gotten into a heated exchange with a manager that ended with her demanding a full refund for a meal she had already finished. Going out to eat was, for Patrice, rarely a quiet experience for anyone around her. On the evening of July 9th, she arrived at the restaurant alone at around 7:15 and was seated at a table near the center of the dining room. She ordered a shellfish dish that included clams and mussels, a house specialty, some of which appeared improperly prepared. When the plate arrived, a woman seated at the adjacent table noticed something was off almost immediately. Several of the shells had not fully opened, which is commonly considered unsafe and a sign that the shellfish should be discarded. The woman also noticed an odor from the plate that concerned her. She leaned over and quietly mentioned her concern to Patrice, keeping it brief and low enough that only Patrice could hear. That consideration was not returned. Patrice's reaction was immediate and loud. She told the woman to mind her own business, made a point of looking her up and down, and announced to the surrounding tables that she did not need a stranger telling her how to eat. The woman tried once more, gently, and Patrice cut her off entirely. People at nearby tables had gone quiet by that point. Rather than flag the concern with staff or set the dish aside, Patrice picked up her fork and finished the entire plate. Witnesses later described it as deliberate, like she was proving something to the room. And honestly, that is the detail that stays with me. Not just that she ignored the warning, but that she made a performance out of ignoring it. She left the restaurant that evening without any immediate symptoms, which is how these situations typically go. Bacterial illness from contaminated shellfish does not show up right away. Within about 18 hours, Patrice began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms consistent with bacterial infection from contaminated shellfish. She did not seek any kind of medical attention at that stage, which was consistent with how she handled most things. By the following day, her condition had gotten considerably worse. She was running a high fever and was visibly declining. A family member who came to check on her made the call for help on the third day. By that point, there was little that could be done. Patrice Hendro died on July 12, 2017. The cause of death was septic shock, resulting from a severe bacterial infection that had progressed into the bloodstream, consistent with contaminated shellfish, which can become life-threatening in certain cases. The woman who had tried to warn her was identified and gave a statement to authorities. Two other diners who had been seated nearby corroborated her account. The restaurant underwent inspection and review by local health authorities following the incident. The case was closed shortly after. A complete stranger flagged it, and that was enough to set her off. The next one I want to get into is different. The warnings did not come from a stranger, and they did not come just once. It was the afternoon of February 3rd, 2017, in Columbus, Ohio. Cold, gray, the kind of winter day where most people would rather stay indoors. The urgent care facilities around the city were seeing their usual seasonal foot traffic, coughs, fevers, the kind of minor complaints that pile up in February. Joelle Stamper was 52 years old. She worked as a supervisor at a retail distribution center on the west side of the city, a job she had held for nearly 9 years. People who worked under her described her as someone who ran a tight floor and expected things done her way, and that was fine in a workplace setting. The problem was that she carried that same energy into every other part of her life. She had a habit of treating anyone in a position of authority or expertise as someone to push back against rather than listen to, doctors especially. Joelle had a deep distrust of the medical system that went back years, and she made no effort to hide it. She believed she understood her own body better than any physician could, and she was vocal about that opinion to anyone who would listen. I've heard that reasoning before, and it always makes me wonder how much of it is genuine belief and how much of it is just fear dressed up as confidence. She had been diagnosed with high blood pressure several years earlier at a routine check. The physician recommended medication and regular monitoring. Joelle refused the medication outright, told the doctor she did not need it, and stopped going to follow-up appointments entirely. Her sister had raised the issue with her more than once over the years and had been shut down every time, sometimes harshly. That kind of dynamic where someone close keeps trying and keeps getting nowhere is something I find genuinely difficult to read about. In the weeks leading up to February 3rd, people close to Joelle noticed she was not quite herself. She had been having persistent headaches that she blamed on work stress and had mentioned her vision felt off on a couple of occasions. Her sister brought up getting checked out, and Joelle dismissed it. It was only after Joelle mentioned a pressure building behind her eyes one morning that her sister pushed hard enough to finally get her out the door. They arrived at a small urgent care facility on the north side of Columbus at around 1:40 in the afternoon. The attending physician conducted an initial assessment and measured Joelle's blood pressure. The reading came back at 210/120, a level that falls within hypertensive crisis range. At those numbers, the risk of stroke becomes immediate and serious. The physician told Joelle directly that her readings were dangerously high and that she needed to stay for further evaluation and treatment. What followed, according to her sister and the clinic staff, was Joelle at her worst. She told the physician he did not know what he was talking about, accused him of inflating her results to justify billing her insurance, and began speaking loudly enough that other people in the waiting area turned to look. When staff attempted to de-escalate, she turned on them as well. She refused every further suggestion, gathered her things with deliberate slowness as if to make a point, and walked out through the front entrance against the physician's direct and repeated instructions. Her sister tried to stop her. Joelle shrugged her off and kept walking. And then, if you can believe it, she made it maybe 30 feet into the parking lot before her body gave out completely. Witnesses outside saw her reach for her car door, hesitate briefly, then collapse before she could open it. She was unconscious before she hit the ground. Joelle Stamper was transported to a nearby hospital where she was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was a hemorrhagic stroke brought on by severe hypertension. Her sister and several clinic staff members witnessed the collapse and gave full statements to authorities. The physician's records from that afternoon, including the blood pressure reading, were part of the documentation. The case was reviewed and closed. I've thought about that parking lot a lot. Her sister was steps behind her and still could not stop what happened. The next one takes place somewhere much colder, and honestly, the person who tried to warn her knew more about that ice than she ever could have. Before I get into the next one, if you're finding value in these stories, subscribing to Fatal Files is the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming. It also helps the channel more than most people realize. It was the morning of January 18th, 2016, in Traverse City, Michigan, the kind of deep winter morning where the cold settles into everything and the landscape goes completely still. The lake country up in that part of Michigan gets serious winters, and January of 2016 was no exception. Sandra Pevlin was 47 years old. She lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and had driven up to northern Michigan alone for what she described to friends and family as a winter getaway. Sandra was self-employed, running a small interior decorating business that gave her enough flexibility to travel when she wanted. People who knew her personally described her as someone who was difficult to be around for extended periods. She had a tendency to talk over people, dismiss local knowledge as unsophisticated, and treat anyone she perceived as beneath her socially or professionally as someone whose input did not merit consideration. I've come across that type before in these stories, and there's usually a trail of small incidents behind them before anything serious happens. Sandra was no different. She had gotten into a heated exchange with a hotel clerk the morning before this incident over a room preference that had not been honored, and had spoken to the staff there in a way that other guests noticed and remembered. Trips like this one were something she took pride in, and she made a point of telling people she did not need guided tours or local recommendations to enjoy a place. She trusted her own judgment, full stop. Sandra arrived in Traverse City on January 16th and spent her first day and a half visiting shops and walking along the bay. On the morning of January 18th, she decided to visit a frozen lake on the rural outskirts of town that she had read about in a travel forum before the trip. She drove out alone, parked along the side of a gravel road, and made her way down a short embankment to the lake's edge. A local man in his late 50s was already there that morning. He had been ice fishing on the safer interior section of the lake since early morning and knew the ice conditions well. He had been coming to that lake every winter for over 2 decades. When he spotted Sandra moving toward the far left bank, he called out to her. That stretch of ice sat above a section where two underwater currents converged, which slows the freezing process significantly. The ice in that area had been measuring well below the 4-inch minimum considered safe for a single person on foot. He had checked it himself that morning and had stayed well away from it. He explained all of this to Sandra directly. She crossed her arms, looked at him for a moment, and told him the ice looked identical across the entire surface and that she had been on frozen lakes before. When he stepped closer and pointed specifically to the area she was heading toward, she raised her voice and told him she did not come all the way out there to be lectured by a stranger. She turned her back to him and stepped onto the ice. I think about that moment sometimes. Someone who drove hours to get somewhere, so certain of themselves that a 2-minute conversation with someone who knew that lake better than anyone was treated like an insult. She had walked approximately 28 feet from the bank when the ice gave way beneath her. The fisherman moved toward her immediately, staying to the thicker sections. A second man, who had been walking along the embankment above, came down when he heard the crack. The two of them attempted to reach Sandra using a rope the fisherman had with him. The opening in the ice was roughly 12 feet from where either of them could safely stand without risking breaking through themselves. They could not close that distance. And what gets me about that is those two men stayed and tried anyway, with what little they had. Sandra Pevlin was recovered from the lake later that afternoon. The cause of death was hypothermia. The fisherman and the man from the embankment both gave statements to authorities, and their accounts were consistent with one another. The case was closed not long after. Those two men with a rope could not close 12 feet, and that detail has never quite left me. The last story in this episode is one I find particularly hard to move past because the danger around her was not subtle. It was actively unfolding. It was the night of October 4th, 2017, in Memphis, Tennessee. A Wednesday, quiet for the most part, the kind of weeknight where most people had already settled in for the evening. The commercial area on the south side of the city was mostly empty by that hour, a stretch of parking lots and low-rise retail buildings with only scattered foot traffic. Trina Offutt was 41 years old. She worked part-time at a shipping and packaging store on the east side of Memphis and lived alone in a rental house about 2 miles from where this incident took place. People who knew Trina described her as someone who held on to grievances longer than most and had a pattern of acting on them in ways that other people found alarming. She had a history of property disputes with neighbors that had escalated on more than one occasion, and there had been at least 2 prior incidents where she had been identified as the person responsible for damage to vehicles belonging to people she had conflicts with. She had also been removed from a local community meeting the year prior after refusing to stop speaking over other attendees and threatening to report the organizers for what she described as discrimination against her. What strikes me about people like Trina is that the pattern is always there well before anything serious happens. It rarely comes out of nowhere. She had a specific grievance against the owner of a silver sedan she had seen parked in a lot she used during work hours. The owner of the vehicle had no connection to Trina personally. She had convinced herself over several days that the car's presence was a deliberate slight, and on the night of October 4th, she decided to act on it. She arrived at the parking lot on foot at around 10:45 in the evening carrying a backpack. She pulled out a can of spray paint and began covering the silver sedan in large painted markings across the hood, doors, and rear panel. A security guard who was doing a routine patrol of the adjoining lot spotted her within a few minutes. He approached and told her directly that she needed to stop and leave the area immediately. He explained that the lot and the surrounding block were within the perimeter of an active police situation. Earlier that evening, an armed robbery had taken place at a small convenience store at the end of the block. The suspect had fled on foot and had not yet been located. Law enforcement was still active in the surrounding area, with officers canvassing nearby streets. Trina did not stop. She told the guard to leave her alone, turned back to the car, and kept going. The guard warned her a second time, more urgently, telling her that staying in that lot was putting her in immediate danger. She turned to face him, raised her voice, and told him he had no authority over her and that she would leave when she was finished. Then she reached for a second can of spray paint and continued. Honestly, the deliberateness of that, reaching for the second can after being warned twice, is the detail that stands out most to me in this one. The guard stepped back and attempted to reach law enforcement by radio. I think about what those few seconds must have felt like for him. standing there, having said everything he could say, watching someone refuse to move. That kind of helplessness is something I don't think I could easily shake. That was when the shots were fired. The suspect, who had been concealed between two parked vehicles further along the same lot, fired after realizing he had been spotted. Trina was struck once in the chest. She went down next to the vehicle she had been painting. The guard, who had moved behind a concrete barrier when he heard the shots, was unharmed. Multiple people in the surrounding area heard the gunfire and contacted authorities. Trina Offit was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest. The suspect was located and apprehended within the same block less than an hour later. The security guard provided a full statement to authorities. The case was reviewed and closed.